For me, Frederick Douglass is one of the most important figures in the 19th century in America, at least, if not in the world. It's because he's really, in many ways, the epitome of the self-made individual during that time period. If you look at his history and you look what he's accomplished, it's an amazing story of, I think, finding ways to be successful, but also finding ways to remain relevant to that society. Looking at his life as an enslaved person, he is an individual who does not accept the fact that enslaved people are not allowed to read. He learns how to do that. He is also a person who doesn't accept the fact that enslaved people should not look to run away. He does that twice. The first time he fails, but it doesn't deter him. He continues to look for a way to gain his freedom and to be a person who has control over his own life. And even after he gains that freedom, he is a person who really believes that he still has a connection to his own community, that has a responsibility to speak to the issues facing them in terms of the society in which they live. And you see this in the sense that even as he gains his freedom, he gets connected with the abolitionist movement, becomes a very forceful spokesperson for the ideas that slavery is a terrible institution within the context of the United States and truly needs to be brought to its knees and gotten rid of. And even then, as part of the abolitionist movement, when he finds that his choices and his ability to express himself are restricted, he steps away and he creates his own format for which he can speak about the issues that are important to him through his newspapers and through his speaking. And throughout that time, he continues to point out how unfair and how evil the institution of slavery is and the need for this country to really begin to attack it. He carries it not only to people across the North, but also to the President of the United States, making contact with Abraham Lincoln and trying to lobby him to think differently about slavery, about its place in this country going forward. And even with the end of slavery and end of the Civil War, you see him continuing down this pathway in which he takes the position that the issues that are still confronting us as a nation have not gone away, that the issues of discrimination, the issues of segregation are still plagues that really bother the African-American community. And he remains a very active spokesman about the need for change within this society. I think in this way, he remains the kind of figure that we all can admire greatly, the kind of figure who believes that you have to really agitate to create change, that you can't let people quietly go about their lives and not realize the injustices that are existing around them. And as a consequence, for me, it makes him a person not only for the 19th century, but also a person for the 20th century and the 21st century. That what he's spoken about has not been taken care of yet, and he remains a figure for all of us to admire, but also to try to emulate as we lead our lives and look for ways in which we can have an impact on our society and allow it to grow towards the kind of nation we want it to be, the kind of place where all people are treated equal and all people are citizens treated the same way in terms of the way the country functions.
Hi, I'm Pete Lesher. I'm curator of the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in St. Michael's, and we are here on location in St. Michael's in front of the Mitchell House, named for its owner, Peter Mitchell, and his wife, Eliza Bailey Mitchell. Eliza Bailey being, of course, the older sister of Frederick Bailey Douglass. This house has been moved from another location in St. Michael's, but it was Peter Mitchell's house over on part of the Perry Cabin Farm in 1833, when Frederick Douglass was returned to the Eastern Shore after having been in Baltimore, having started to learn to read. He's returned back to St. Michael's, and he is a very unhappy 15-year-old living in the kitchen shed behind the Thomas Auld house on the corner of Cherry and Talbot Streets in St. Michael's, living there with his sister, Eliza Bailey, who is encouraging him. Now, she is sort of a common law wife to a free black man by the name of Peter Mitchell, who lives in this house and is making, of course, the trips at night over to meet her husband, who works on the Perry Cabin Farm. So he's working for the Hambletons on the Perry Cabin Farm. She is working for the Aulds right here in St. Michael's with her younger brother, Frederick Bailey, later Douglass. She is encouraging Douglass. Douglass is, at this point, a hungry teenager a hungry 15-year-old who is not given enough meal by his stingy masters, and he is stealing food, rationalizing at this point that, well, my master considers me property. This food is his property. I am merely reallocating my master's property. He's beginning to lay the groundwork for some of his philosophy that when he later lectures on abolitionism after he frees himself. This is a place where he's starting to form those thoughts. It is the year after his return to St. Michael's that he is taken to the slave breaker, Edward Covey, also just outside of St. Michael's. But it was at this house. Undoubtedly, he visited his sister over at this house as well, because the old residence was a terribly overcrowded house and store, family and slaves all in a very small space. Frederick Douglass walked here in St. Michael's, and this is part of his formative story that he will bring into his narrative in his life and in his writings right here in St. Michael's.
My name is Lee Blake. I am the president of the New Bedford Historical Society. And our historical society is an organization that celebrates African American, Cape Verdean, West Indian history and culture. So we are essentially a Black organization, and Douglass very much plays into that story. Frederick Douglass runs away, as you know, in 1838. He escapes, he goes to New York, and when he goes and gets to New York, he is met by David Ruggles. And David Ruggles, as well as William Still, many of the Underground Railroad conductors would do kind of like an interview. What did you do on the plantation that you worked with? Where do you want to go? What are your work skills? And Douglass had worked on the Maryland piers and had been a caulker. And a caulker is someone who fills in some of the lines on the ship as they're doing shipbuilding to make sure that it's waterproof. So he had very good maritime skills. And of course, he had worked on a dock. So Ruggles says, well, we're going to send you to New Bedford, because in New Bedford, you can use your skills, you'll get a job, you'll be able to stay there for a period of time until you decide where you might want to go. And New Bedford was well known, first of all, because we did have the whaling industry here. And New Bedford had a large Black population at the time. So Douglass, in September 17th, 1838, he's in New York. David Ruggles helps him bring his fiancée, Anna Murray Douglass, to New York. They get married, and the next day they are on a stagecoach and a boat to come to New Bedford. Anna has a big part in this because she is the individual who outfits Douglass in a sailor's uniform so that he can travel without being accosted. And that also tells you how important sailors were at the time, because no one really bothers him. He gets to New Bedford, and when he comes to New Bedford, they have Anna and Fred have their luggage. They have no money. So they get to the stagecoach area, and Douglass explains that he's being sent to New Bedford and he's coming to see Nathan Johnson. Now, Nathan Johnson was an African-American entrepreneur. He was an abolitionist. He was involved in the anti-slavery movement here in New Bedford, but he also was involved nationally in the Black Convention movement. So he had a good reputation, knew people, had a lot of contacts, and was friends with David Ruggles. So the stagecoach driver sends Fred up the street. It's only like 10 blocks up the street to Nathan and Polly's house. They pay for his luggage and everything, and he is going to stay with them. In Frederick Douglass's narrative, he talks about living there for a short period of time. The Nathan and Polly Johnson house was an Underground Railroad site. Nathan Johnson explains to Frederick and Anna that New Bedford is a relatively safe city for them to live in, and that they would help them, Nathan would help them find a place to live, but they could settle at the house, at the Johnson house, and they would help them get work and everything. So one of the important things that happens almost immediately is that Frederick Douglass realizes that he needs to change his name. So Frederick Augustus Bailey needs to change his name. And he says to Nathan, well, I could be Frederick Johnson. And Nathan says, do you know how many Johnsons there are in New Bedford? He said, why don't you pick another name? So it so happens that Nathan Johnson is reading Sir Walter Scott's book, Lady of the Lake, and the main character's name is Douglas. So he says, you know, this is an interesting name. So that is how Frederick Douglass gets his name. That Nathan is reading a book, and the main character protagonist's name is Douglas, and Frederick Douglass takes that as his name. So one of the first things, the Johnson house is important because Douglas comes there for shelter. He also he receives his name there, his new name, his free name, and it's the first place that he lives in freedom is in New Bedford. Now, the Johnson house is still available. The New Bedford Historical Society was able to purchase the house, research the house, and we've restored the house. And that's taken about 25 years, but with grants. And I also sent down a virtual tour of the house so people can see what it looked like. The Johnson family, Nathan and Polly, were business owners. Polly owned a confectioner store. She made candy, and she made candy with free sugar. So they were very involved in the abolitionist movement. Nathan was a member of the Anti-Slavery Society, as I mentioned, and the Black Convention movement. So they were always organizing and figuring out ways to work to end enslavement. So it was an interesting environment for Frederick to come into. He's 20 years old. He can read because he'd been reading the Columbian Orator. He understood the importance of education. And there are people here who allowed him to use their library. The First Unitarian Church, the minister there, would pay him to move coal, and he was allowed to use the library. The churches here allowed him to come and give sermons. So at 20, 21, he's giving sermons. He's learning about freedom and how Black people can organize for their own cause for freedom. Frederick Douglass takes his first vote here. The Black community runs candidates here, and Frederick pays his poll tax and he votes. Frederick Douglass's first 3 children are born here. So Rosetta, Lewis, and Frederick Douglass Jr. are all born here. He lives at least 3 different other residences, all of which have been destroyed, but the Johnson house is still here. One church that he went to, he had to sit in the back, and he protests that and tries to change that policy of Black people sitting in the back. And he wrote a really important essay on churches and the way that Christians support or don't support Black people, which you can still read. So New Bedford was important in a lot of ways because it helped Frederick develop his abolition skills. And it is from New Bedford that he is discovered at a rally in Nantucket. I think it's 1844. And that's when he begins to be involved in the anti-slavery lecture circuit. And leaves New Bedford and becomes really an important figure. But I also wanted people to know that Douglass comes back to New Bedford often. There would be parades here. Douglass comes and he is the keynote at parades. There are weddings that Douglass comes to. And during the Civil War, Douglass comes to New Bedford to work on recruiting free African Americans to be in the 54th Regiment. And I can say that Douglass was even here a year before he dies, because he comes to the 50th anniversary of William Jackson, who was a minister here, but he was one of the first ministers of the 54th, and he lived in New Bedford. So you have it's interesting because there's a new book coming out on Douglass that's really going to focus on the importance that Douglass saw in the relationships he had with people around the world. And it's lots of discussion about how important it was for Douglass to keep these kind of ties with people. And New Bedford was lucky that the people here were able to keep ties with him. The Historical Society, while we have taken care of the Johnson House, we have bought the land across the street, and we have commissioned a statue of Frederick Douglass as a young man. So our statue will focus on Douglass when he was in his 20s, as opposed to when he was in a great oratory.
Okay, well, firstly, it's really my pleasure to be part of these celebrations and to be able to speak to Frederick Douglass's importance to Ireland, where I'm from, and on whose importance to Ireland I've been working on for quite some time. Douglass, as everyone knows, first arrived in Ireland in 1845, and Ireland provided the first truly free soil on which he was able to stand. At that time, Douglass was escaping the United States, and when he arrived in Ireland as a fugitive, he was a fugitive not from justice, but working for justice. And one of his earliest comments on arriving in Ireland concerned the fact that it was a place in which he could breathe. And being able to breathe, he said, allowed him to be fully a man, to live, as he said, a new life. For Douglass, being able to breathe freely was transformative, and he in turn became a transformative presence in Ireland. He republished his autobiography there, where it sold strongly. He wrote of his experiences to family, friends, and abolitionist colleagues, and his letters and speeches frequently appeared in Irish newspapers and in the pages of The Liberator. As he travelled widely around Ireland, he brought his first-hand and irrefutable knowledge of American slavery and its consequences for those affected to an Irish audience, as he addressed key questions of human rights, human dignity, and the struggle for freedom. So in this way, in Ireland, he turned civic and religious venues where he was speaking into places of possibility, where he could use his talents to the full, and in doing so, bring about social change. We might say that by speaking freely, he forced a reckoning with oppression that brooked no argument, that revealed the need for moral action, and that challenged all those aspects of social and economic and political power in which many, including some in his audience, were in some way implicated. So faced with Douglass's testimony and argument, no one present could plead ignorance of oppression or innocence in the face of the wider truth that slavery was part of the economic and social and cultural bedrock of the entire Atlantic world. Now, 21st century Ireland is a very different country. In fact, it's two countries, to the place in which Frederick Douglass spoke and wrote as a self-emancipated fugitive. In 1845, it was one of the home nations of the United Kingdom and part of an empire which had only just abolished slavery in its own colonies, just 7 years before. When Douglass left the United States, he was fleeing one major humanitarian disaster, slavery, and when he arrived in Ireland, he encountered another one, the onset of the Great Famine of 1845 to 47. He was able to demonstrate, though, that actively pursuing one human rights agenda did not mean neglecting others. And here's what he said: "Though I am more closely connected and identified with one class of outraged, oppressed, and enslaved people," he wrote, "I cannot allow myself to be insensible to the wrongs and suffering of any part of the great family of man." Now that the Republic is an independent country, while Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom. Frederick Douglassy is one that is common to both. Although Douglass could not at that time be a citizen of any country, he perfectly demonstrated what active critical citizenship can mean, what working for justice entails, and what costs are for those involved in personal, family, and political terms. Douglass lived out his self-emancipation on Irish soil, and he showed that emancipation was not a single event, but a continuing process of teaching, of learning, and of struggle that involves speaking to others and speaking for those to whom power did not allow a voice. The solidarity expressed with those suffering hunger and deprivation illustrates the possibility that common cause can be made in matters of justice, rights, and freedom, and that even in the most adverse of circumstances, change for the better is possible. Frederick Douglass's optimism, and optimism enabled a little perhaps by being able to breathe freely, is part of his legacy to Ireland, because he has shown that we can choose our relationships to privilege and to struggle and to each other, and in doing so help imagine the future and the justice that he hoped for.
My name is Celeste-Marie Bernier, and I'm based in Scotland, and I currently work at the University of Edinburgh, and I have spent 25 years of my life researching the words, the power, the life force that is Frederick Douglass. And in the work that I do, I work between the United States and Scotland and Europe more generally to work with his words as he tells the power and the life stories of those who've lived and died, who've suffered, who've struggled, but who've survived in the resistance movement across the African diaspora for millennia. Douglass is a powerful figure who we need as oxygen today in 2020, who taught us many lessons of life, many lessons of learning, and many lessons which we need to keep learning in the social justice struggle. Douglass, in his life dedicated to activism, authorship, and artistry, was a person who believed that human rights were all rights, that all rights were of no color, creed, or nation, and that we all had a responsibility to use our broken humanity to create a beautiful new world. In the work that I've done on Douglass in those decades, I've been working in thinking about Douglass's dedication to writing as power. He described words as weapons in the freedom struggle, and to thinking through Douglass's power as a person, how he lived through struggle, how he lived with pain, how he lived with Frederick Bailey in the life that became Frederick Douglass. And in the work that we've done recently in Scotland, we've recently put a plaque to his memory to the building that he lived in as Scotland's anti-slavery agent. And it was from there that he worked and spoke in the freedom struggle and began his journeys across Scotland. And for Douglass, Scotland as a nation was one that he understood had very much its hands covered in blood, covered in sin, covered in the immoral practice as human traffickers in blood as part of the international slave trade. But he also understood Scotland as a nation of freedom fighters. And he took his special joy and hope and happiness in the memory of James Douglas, the Highland leader who Douglas took as inspiration for his own name, Frederick Douglass. And he spoke often of that moment with Nathan Johnson in New Bedford when there came the moment to rename Frederick Douglass, that he said, I took the Black Douglas for my inspiration. And he said, as I live and breathe in Scotland, this was his words in 1847, there is not a stream, not a mountain, not a river that does not flow with the blood of the struggle of human liberty. And so we got a plaque to his memory on the building here, and we've been running walking tours, and the Frederick Douglass Honor Society were our first guests on this walking tour. We had folks come, and we did a 3-hour walking tour, taking us through all the sites and places that Douglass lived and worked in Edinburgh. And one of the things that he did when he was in Edinburgh was he decided that he would hold the white Christian traffickers in blood, as he described it, your Christianity is of no Christ. And he took a spade, and at 4 a.m. in May 1846, he went with 2 white Quaker women, John and Eliza Wigham, And he took his spade and he carved into the landscape of Arthur's Seat, the big mountain that overshadows Edinburgh and is just behind me, you can see outside. And he carved into the landscape, "Send back the money." So Douglass wanted the nation, the landscape of Scotland to tell the freedom struggle. And he wanted those inhuman traffickers in blood to send back the money to Scotland. And as he said, they never did send back the money. They never did send it back from Louisiana. He said, but we succeeded in creating a fire and put Scotland on fire in the anti-slavery liberation movement. So part of the work has been to tell the story of Douglass internationally, to talk about him as what we need now, as a person who gives us lessons in how to be better, live better, to be more morally responsible to the social justice change we need to be. And also part of the work has been over 25 years of telling the story of Anna Murray, of Rosetta, of Lewis Henry, of Charles Remont, of Annie, of Frederick Jr. There would be no Frederick Douglass without the intergenerational freedom struggle of the Douglass family. And so one of the most beautiful, powerful phrases of any person is the words of Anna Murray Douglass when she said, "Why not I endure hardship that my race may be free?" And so what I'm doing at the moment is the 3-volume Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass family papers to tell the freedom story of a collective family where we can all use our broken humanity to build a new world and to build and continue to be responsible for building the world that Douglass believed we could be and we could live in.
Douglass had many events in his life and without a very promising future. His mother taken away from him, some of his siblings, his grandmother who raised him and all of that. And finally, he and Anna joined and made an escape from Maryland to New York City and on to Massachusetts. Things were looking upward. However, this heavy burden troubled him, and he was reminded of it very often as he sought to be involved in the anti-slavery movement, to say things about it and to use the wonderful features that he had developed in his own way to search and speak on behalf of liberation. And even under the Garrison group in Massachusetts, it was difficult. So eventually he would step out on his own and be encouraged by different people and eventually land in Rochester, New York, where the welcoming was much more advantaged to him and advantage to making the Rochester a central part of the movement in abolishing slavery. And in fact, if you wait until, if you look at that last week in December 1862, after Mr. Lincoln had pronounced that he would issue Emancipation Proclamation the following day, Douglass took to the pulpit at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and he made it clear that he believed that Mr. Lincoln would sign the Emancipation Proclamation. There were a lot of people doubting and very upset about the possibility that Lincoln would have to shy away, but he assured the people there in Rochester, because he had so much welcoming from people to help him do what he knew how to do. And he said, I'm so sure he's going to do it, sign the Emancipation Proclamation, that I'm going to Massachusetts. I'm going to be in Boston on the day that the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. I'm going to be there where the first blood for American independence was shed by Crispus Attucks, a former slave, a Black man who wanted to be free, stay free, and help make freedom the central part of the United States of America. And he did that, and people did, leaving that night venture at the church, begin to pray. And the prayers were heard in Rochester and went beyond. And there were echoes of it in the South, where people slipped off into the bush to pray that Mr. Lincoln would sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is a result, one of the results that occurred because Douglass was so pleased with the way people responded to him in Rochester. Moreover, his 5th child was born there. So he had a family that could freely express themselves as being people who wanted to be part of the freedom movement. And even though little Annie, the lone child born here in Rochester, would pass while Frederick Douglass was trying to stay away from the clutches of the United States military, who wanted to haul him in because he was deemed as part of John Brown's efforts to abolish slavery by seizing the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He had been against Brown doing that, but somehow Brown insisted that he would, and Douglass was implicated despite the fact that he was against what Brown wanted to do. But Rochester was the place, maybe the place in the world, that he could come and begin to display what he had learned in the struggle for get his own freedom. And he had learned about family, and he had learned about the future being a possible free United States of America, no more slavery. And he would continue to, he couldn't print a newspaper outside of Rochester. In New England, they wouldn't, it was not something that people supported. And even those who liked what he had to say, but they wanted to do it their way and not have him in the forefront. So Douglass found home here. They got property here, and the Underground Railroad safe house that was established on the Douglass property was probably the central or most used, we like to think, in this upstate New York arena. He was happy that people would come, and there were numerous visitors. He had assistance from people that he had met and worked with when he was in England, who come to help it make it possible. They supported the newspaper that he put together and began to publish. It could not be published on his terms anywhere else but here in Rochester. So he is our man. The first statue, the first public statue dedicated to an African American in that era, and maybe for a long time afterwards, is the statue that was designed, that was calculated to be a tribute to the United States colored troops, those roughly 200,000 Black men who, after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, were able to enlist in the Union Army, and therefore became the margin for the Union victory. 2 of his sons were Union soldiers, and it happened, and it happened, and eventually we get one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Hello, everybody. I'm David Blight. I'm in New Haven, Connecticut, where I teach at Yale University. I have many times been to Talbot County to research Frederick Douglass, but also and particularly to speak with and for and to enjoy the company of the Frederick Douglass Honor Society. I am wearing their t-shirt today, which I believe was given to me a year or two ago by Eric and Harriet, the late Eric, whom we all miss. In my short time on this video, I would just like to say that not only is Frederick Douglass so very important to Talbot County, to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where he spent the first 20 years of his life, or at least 11 of his years as a slave, his 20 years as a slave, were spent out on the Eastern Shore. The other 9 in Baltimore, of course, which was crucial. But beyond that experience, this completely formative experience of his life as a slave in Maryland, Douglass went on, of course, to become many, many more things. And lots of you know that. But he became, above all else, I think, the prose poet of American democracy, with a kind of unsurpassed eloquence in his writing and his speaking. He explained the experience of slavery in both its physical and its mental elements better than any American of the 19th century. He expressed with a kind of terrible honesty the savage irony of America's creeds and its hypocrisy. He did so in that famous 4th of July speech that he gave in Rochester in 1852, but he did it many other places, many other ways, in the autobiographies as well as in the speeches and his editorials. To see and to hear Douglass became a kind of American wonder of the world. People who would come to America, or certainly Americans who lived here, would tell their stories about the first time they saw Douglass, the first time they heard Douglass. He was a women's rights man. Long before there were very many women's rights men. He was at Seneca Falls, the only African-American to speak at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. He was always a women's rights man, both the voting rights and even women's economic rights, which he supported in the state of New York. He will get into a terrible fight later with some of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement over the 15th Amendment, which did not include women. That's a long story. But it's complicated by the simple fact that if women had been in that 15th Amendment, it's a fact of history, it simply would never have passed. He could at times be a radical thinker about American ideals and American principles and about protest strategies, but at other times he was a kind of political liberal of the 19th century, who believed in the law, or he wanted at least to believe in changing the country through the law and through the Constitution if possible. Douglass, you can't fit Frederick Douglass into boxes in his public and political career. He sometimes is that radical outsider beating on the doors and demanding to get in, and then he's sometimes the political insider later in his life, arguing that you can still change this country through law and through politics. At times, it is worth remembering that Douglass both loved and hated his country. I think that is particularly important right now, as are many other legacies of Douglass's in our own time. We are hearing now about African Americans and others who have been through periods in their lives of either loving or hating their country because of their country's behavior, because of their country's practices, because of their country's hypocrisies. He sometimes preached strong self-reliance to his fellow Blacks, and he did indeed preach that. But he also was a firm believer in the uses of government, the interventionist uses of government to, let's face it, first destroy slavery, then to defeat the Confederacy, then to establish and try to preserve Black civil and political rights. He also, as a political thinker, forged over time kind of a hard-earned pragmatism about events, about ideas, about politics. He was often disappointed and near despair at the results of the crusade against slavery, or the results of the crusade to save the great achievements of the Civil War in the 14th and 15th Amendments and in Black civil and political rights. But he never completely lost hope in the cause. And that was rooted for Douglass in two deep traditions in which his ideas can always be found. One tradition is from the Bible. It really is from particularly the Old Testament, the creeds of the Bible. But it also came from his beliefs in and how steeped he was in the Enlightenment, and particularly the natural rights tradition. So he's deeply steeped in a religious sacred tradition, which is how he came by language when he was still in Maryland, and in a secular tradition from the Enlightenment. Douglass seized upon the King James language of the Bible and learned to use words as almost no one else did in the 19th century. I've been asked many, many times, what is Douglass's greatest legacy? There are many of them, and I could spend too much time saying that today. But we will always know him in his words. We will always know him in the great speeches. We will always know him in some of those great political editorials that he wrote in his newspaper in the 1850s. We will always know him in those three great autobiographies, in the 1,200 pages of his autobiographies. That's where you will find the prose poet. And also, if you're looking for, in these troubled times in the United States, a politics with a moral purpose, a politics with a moral core, read Frederick Douglass. Read him deeply, read about him widely. And the last thing I'll simply say is that in my new biography of Douglass, I employed the word prophet in the title. I called him the prophet of freedom. Prophet's a big word. No one should ever use that word too lightly. We sometimes do that in our common language. But Douglass did have a prophetic voice, not simply in the kind of profane way that we use that term. He didn't necessarily predict things that would happen. He wasn't right about everything. He didn't lay out the future, but he spoke about the crises of his own time in words most other people could not create or master. He had a way of explaining race and racism. He had a way of explaining the experience of slavery. He had a way of explaining the importance and the power of slavery in the American political system. And after the Civil War, he had a way of explaining what that war had been truly about. And in the older part of his life, he came to find words to explain what was happening to the United States in the Gilded Age. And he ended his life with that great speech about lynching, one of the most desperate and despairing and awful subjects of all. And if you ever get a chance to read his speech on lynching that he gave dozens and dozens of times in the last year and a half of his life, it's called Lessons of the Hour. It has a three-part explanation of why lynching was happening in the 1890s. And that explanation, that series of explanations, still holds up today. Douglass will always be there with us in his prose, in his writing, in the words that he left for us to find him in. Thank you for listening. I am thrilled to be asked by the Douglass Honor Society of Talbot County and of Maryland And I can't wait for my next chance to come visit Talbot County and see all my good friends there. Thank you very much.
Good day, everyone. My name is Richard Tilghman, and I am the 12th generation Lloyd to live here at Y House. And I'm delighted that you could join me today as we celebrate Frederick Douglass Day here in Talbot County. I'm standing in front of what we call the captain's house here at our property. This house was used during the 19th century as the kitchen for the plantation. And this is where Frederick Douglass first came to Y in 1824. And he lived here as a young boy, probably age 6 to 8, from 1824 to 1826. As he put it, he lived on, quote, the floor of a rough closet which opened into the kitchen. The kitchen was presided over by Aunt Katie, and young Frederick was subjected to, in the words of Professor David Blight, quote, the stern and abusive rule of the cook. While at Y, Frederick was the companion of 12-year-old Daniel Lloyd. Daniel was being taught at the, quote, big house, end quote, and Frederick would frequently meet Daniel after school. As Professor Blight reports, quote, this may be where Douglass first sensed the power of what went on in a schoolroom. Let's fast forward 55 years to June of 1881, when Morsell Douglass, as he would have then been called, now a very, very famous American, returned by ship to Y House. The then owner, the 7th Edward Lloyd, my great-great-grandfather, quote, conveniently had gone to Easton on business. After all, it was the Jim Crow era. So Douglass was greeted by my great-grandfather, 18-year-old Charles Howard Lloyd, and his younger brother DeCourcy. As Professor Blight put it, the two Lloyds were certainly, quote, in awe of Douglass, the elder statesman. After a tour of the grounds led by the two young Lloyds, Douglass was invited onto the rear veranda, as he called it. Today we call it the porch, where he sipped wine and chatted for quite a while. Douglass described his surroundings that day as, quote, a more tranquil and tranquilizing scene I have seldom seen in this or any other country. Professor Blight summarized the visit by saying, the honor Douglass came to seize that day could be extended by white people named Lloyd. It was truly a day of mutual respect and one that my great-grandfather cherished for the rest of his life. Today we pay homage to one of the greatest Americans of the 19th century, whose wisdom and deeds are still recognized today throughout the world. There's no reason for me to attempt to recount Douglass's rise from slavery to freedom or his critical importance to Americans of all races then and today. Rather, I would like to conclude with these simple words. The Talbot Boys statue has got to go.
My name is Carlene Phoenix, and I'm standing in front of Asbury United Methodist Church, which is located in our community known as The Hill, in the town of Easton and in the county of Talbot County. So this church was a week old when Frederick Douglass returned to Talbot County in 1878. And he came here and he dedicated this church. And he also delivered a speech here at Asbury. And this was in the morning, and I believe it was November of 1878. And then from there, he moved on to the next church, which is Bethel. I can just imagine the people once they knew he was coming, how they were lined up, probably in their Sunday best, welcoming a ray of hope. It was a ray of hope, a ray of sunshine. We don't know what he said to him, but we knew it had to be. Knowing Frederick Douglass, it was an inspirational message. It was a message of hope. It was a message of keep doing what you're doing because you are making a difference. With the Hill, we knew that this was a community that was prominent with African Americans. And I did not realize just how prominent it was that there were freed African Americans who lived here ever since the maybe 1780s. And they lived in times when there was a lot of civil unrest. In times where 12, 15 miles down the road, there were enslaved people that lived on plantations. And the biggest plantation was the wire plantation. And so I came to realize that these people were people of faith. They had to have a faith the size of a mustard seed because there was a lot of big mountains that they had to move in order for them to sustain and to be able to have livability here in this community amongst all the unrest that was going on, knowing that they wasn't considered citizens, but they remained here. And also too is that this neighborhood, which we know the earliest records is 1780, but here in 2020 this neighborhood still exists. And it exists from the fact that these were people who knew that their lives mattered, that they cared. And so now we have this opportunity to be able to have people recognize the significance of this neighborhood, which is, we're not going to say the oldest, but it's one of the older existing neighborhoods in Easton and in the county of Talbot.
Hello, my name is Sarah Meer, and I'm delighted to be joining you for Frederick Douglass Day from Cambridge in England. I teach American literature in the University of Cambridge, and I've been fascinated by Douglass for almost 30 years. And I'm going to talk today very briefly about his connections here, as close as I can. So Douglass visited Great Britain and Ireland 3 times, in 1845 to 7, in 1859 to 60, and in 1886. The first 2 trips were anti-slavery lecture tours, where he campaigned against racism and segregation. The final trip was a personal journey with his second wife, Helen Pitts, a sightseeing tour that also took them to Italy and Greece and Egypt. And on that 1886 trip, Douglass visited a friend that he'd made 4 decades before, Julia Griffiths Crofts. Now, Crofts had been so inspired by Douglass on his first trip that she had actually traveled to the United States, to Rochester, in 1849 to assist him with his work. And she lived there and worked with him for 6 years. When Julia returned to England in 1855, they remained close friends. And so in 1886, the Douglasses stayed with Julia for a week in a small town called St. Neots, which is 15 miles from where I'm sitting today. They even visited Cambridge one day, we know from their diary, to see the colleges. So it's good to renew a Cambridge link with Douglass once again. Now, on that first trip, Douglass made quite an impression in Britain. He made speeches all over the country, and he sold copies of his autobiography, which had just been published when he set off. Special editions were published in Britain and Ireland for distribution on this side of the Atlantic. Now, we know that the British writer Charles Dickens read Douglass's narrative, and he even gave a copy as a present to his friend, the actor William Macready. And as a result, critics have suggested that the first line of Douglass's book, "I was born in Tuckahoe," made its way in a strange way into Dickens's novel, Bleak House, where there is a fictional charity dedicated to helping the Tocahupo Indians. And critics think that Dickens was fascinated by the name, and so he sort of borrowed it. So Tuckahoe Creek may have made its way into literature in several ways. But Douglass also made an impression on ordinary people of all ages and in all walks of life. The radical writers William and Mary Howitt invited him to their London home, where Douglass met Mary's elderly mother. And after that visit, Mary wrote to her sister saying that Douglass had filled their mother with anti-slavery fervor, which she was expressing in knitting. She was knitting for the anti-slavery bazaar in Boston to sell the knitting for fundraising purposes. And Mary wrote, "It's really quite amazing in one at her time of life, this knitting." So that's just one example of the transatlantic bonds of friendship and activism that Douglass established in the 1840s. And when he returned to the United States, he set up a newspaper for a transatlantic readership. A good proportion of his subscribers were British and Irish. And you can see that on its pages. They send in letters and news. And Douglass recorded regular donations from this side of the pond for the Underground Railroad stop that his colleagues were running in Rochester. Now, a good many of these correspondents and fundraisers are women. And arguably Douglass enabled many women to take part in politics and to put their voices into print. And British newspapers reprinted Douglass because his newspaper was circulating here. They would reprint some of his columns or quote his opinions, particularly during the 1850s and during the Civil War. So Douglass made quite an impact in Britain in the mid-19th century, and he's an even more important figure today. There are still talk about putting up a statue to Douglass in all sorts of places. And as I mentioned, I teach him in my own institution. And when I do, I'm proud to mention that local connection that brought him sightseeing here in 1886. Thank you.
Greetings, I'm Kirkland Hall. I'm a native son of the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where in the neighboring county, Frederick Douglass was born into escaped slavery. Today, I'm in my hometown of Preston in Somerset County, Maryland, on the courthouse lawn. And in this town, 3 souls were lynched. Isaac Kemp in 1894, William Andrews in 1897, and George Armwood in 1933, who were lynched and then burned on this very courthouse lawn. I'm a public commissioner on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was formed by the Maryland State Legislature in 2019. Its mission is to research cases of racially motivated lynchings and hold public meetings and regional hearings where lynching of an African American by a white mob has been documented. You may be wondering how Frederick Douglass and lynching and Truth Reconciliation Commission today are connected, and why we want to shine a light on this terrible part of our history. In David Blight's biography of Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, he called lynching the final cause of his life. Douglass believed that lynching constituted the political solacing of black people and saw lynching as a paving the way for the entire disenfranchisement of black people. In Maryland, a border state to the south, there were 42 lynchings, 5 occurring in the 20th century. Here on the Eastern Shore, there were 12 lynchings from 1891 to 1933, 1 each in the towns of Centerville, Chesterfield, Pocomoke, and Crisfield, 4 in Precious Ann, and 2 in the city of Salisbury. In Douglass's last great public address, The Lessons of the Hour, sometimes called Why the Negroes Lynch, he presents an analysis of lynching in its historic context as a justification for the persecution of African Americans. Lynching and the threat of lynching created an environment of terror where racial subordination and segregation could be maintained, with limited resistance for decades after slavery was ended by the 13th Amendment. In this speech, Douglass takes on the fundamental motive for lynching, what he calls a horrible and hell-black charge of rape as a peculiar crime of the colored people of the South, by citing the fact that all through the Civil War, while the slave masters of the South were absent from their homes, fighting for the Confederacy, the girls and women of the families were left in the custody of the slaves without a single crime or assault on a white woman charged against them. In his speech, several things echo today. First, he calls it what he calls the mob killers for openly and deliberately nullifying and violating the Constitution and cheating the Negro out of his constitutional right to vote. Today, we still struggle against people who try to suppress the vote, especially that of black people. Second, in his speech, Douglass quotes Bishop Haygood, a progressive bishop, author, and president of Emory College, saying the most alarming fact is the execution by lynching has ceased to surprise us. Today, systemic racism and police brutality have continued unabated, while society at large, and especially white people, turn a blind eye to its existence. Another connection between Douglass and lynching is the Talbot County courthouse alone. Here he was jailed for a week in 1836 for attempting to escape slavery and daily taunted slave traders with the prospect of being sold to Georgia or Florida. At this very same site, in April of 1920, 2,000 white people forming a mob with ropes and knives attempt on lynching Isaiah Fountain on the first day of his trial. Eventually, Mr. Fountain was wrongly convicted, and hung on the gallows on July 23, 1920, in the Talbot County Jail. When the era of racial tension and widespread lynching ended in the mid-20th century, the nation was fundamentally altered by the preceding decade of systemic community-based violence against black Americans. The effects of the lynching era echoed into the present. African Americans continue to face violent intimidation when they transgress social boundaries or assert their civil rights, and the criminal justice system continues to devalue black life and operate as a tool to subordinate African Americans. These legacies are what the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission plan to confront. The struggle to end violence and brutality in all its forms against African Americans has never ended and continues today. The struggle against voter suppression of African Americans continues today. The struggle is a fulfillment and continuation of Douglass's unfinished agenda as a part of his legacy. For more information on how to get involved, check out the related links at the Frederick Douglass Honor Society and.com on High Essay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kenneth B. Morris Jr., and I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, and I'm also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. We're an abolitionist and anti-racist organization with the mission to build strong children and to end systems of exploitation and oppression. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this Douglass Day virtual event. I've had the opportunity over a couple of years to be able to be with you in person. And I'm sorry this year that we couldn't gather together because of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're dealing with, but I know that we'll have a great virtual event. So I'm honored to have an opportunity to be able to share with you just a little bit about some thoughts that I have. And whenever I think about the Eastern Shore of Maryland, it makes me think about Highland Beach, Maryland, which is the resort community not too far from Easton, Maryland, that was founded by my great-great-grandfather, Charles Douglass, who was the youngest son of Frederick and Anna Murray Douglass. And he bought some property on the Chesapeake Bay, on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, and he parceled out that property, but he kept a couple of plots, one for his father to build a retirement home. And when he was ready to put the plans down, and to begin construction of the house, he asked Frederick, are there any special features that you'd like to see in the home? And Frederick had two requests. He said, I wanted to point in a certain direction, and I want a tower at the top of the house. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life is he wanted to sit up in that tower and look back across the Chesapeake Bay, look back across the water to the eastern shore of Maryland. And when you look back across that water, you can see land. And that land is the place where Frederick Douglass was born, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, born into slavery to an enslaved woman and to a white man. And it was presumed that his master was his father. And so Frederick understood that history was important for a lot of reasons. But as I believe, I think history is most important because we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed. And here was this man who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor, the first African-American to be the recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, and the list goes on and on and on. And while he had been born into slavery and had suffered through the brutality of his enslavement and the exploitation of 20 years of being in bondage, he never wanted to forget where he came from. And I used to spend all of my summers in that house until I was a teenage boy. And I remember in the house, there were images of my ancestors in every room. And I remember being about 5 or 6 years old, and at the top of the stairs was this larger-than-life portrait of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. And I remember looking at that portrait one night and seeing the steely glare, him looking back at me. And I thought to myself, man, you look mean. And I'm glad I didn't know you. And as I would try and tiptoe or sneak past that portrait, his eyes would follow me. And in my little boy imagination, I always imagined this booming baritone voice bellowing down upon my tiny person. And he would say, you will do great things, young man. And that was a lot of pressure to try and live up to. And quite frankly, I spent most of my life trying to step out of the shadows of my great ancestors. And one of the things that I didn't understand at that age about that photograph was that my great ancestor understood that he needed to present himself through photography, through the medium of photography and that technology, as a person that was worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship. And what he was doing strategically was he was trying to counteract all of the negative caricatures about people of African descent and this idea that people of African descent were not worthy of freedom, were not worthy of citizenship, and perhaps they were better off in slavery. You know, they're getting the Christian religion, listen to the happy songs that they're singing. What those that were pro-slavery, what they were doing and the federal government was they were making a group of people and other to justify taking away their humanity and their freedom. And as a boy, I didn't understand that he said, I never want to look like a happy, amiable fugitive slave. And so when I would just see that fiery gaze, that steely glare, that was all I knew. And I didn't want any part of it. But I just feel so honored to have the blood of Frederick flowing through my veins, and also Anna Murray Douglass. And I just want to say a few words about her because she's a very important person. We're commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment this year and women's rights and women's suffrage. And so I think it's really important that I lift up her life and legacy. She was the first person in her family to be born free. And while she was living and working in Baltimore, and Frederick was enslaved in Baltimore, they would meet at some point. And she was one of the first people to plant the seed of thought in his mind that, Frederick, you're not meant to be a slave. And as they're starting to think about a life together, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. And had she not sold her personal belongings to help finance his escape, had she not sewn the sailor's disguise that he would wear, who knows if he would have had the courage or the wherewithal to escape from slavery on September 3rd, 1838 at the age of 20. And had she not helped him, we may be a very different country today had we not had the contributions of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist. They were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together and 21 grandchildren. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad out of their house in Rochester, New York, where she helped to ferry hundreds of freedom seekers to freedom in Canada. And I am just as proud of her as I am of him. I'm just as much a product of her as I am of him. And so I want to make sure that we remember Anna Murray Douglass today as we remember Frederick Douglass and the Douglass family and the contributions that they made to freedom, to the abolition of slavery. So I thank you all very much for giving me an opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I wish you the best for a great day and a great program, and I look forward to the opportunity, hopefully next year, to be able to get together in person. Thank you very much.
It was a little more than 36 years ago, the spring of 1984, I think, that I first became interested in the life of Frederick Douglass. I was living in LA at the time, and I was, trying to get work in television and film and so on and so forth. And I became friends with a Black clergyman. And one day during a conversation, he was expressing his desire to see what he could do to develop some alternative programs for some of the inner city youth, programs that would help them to find a sense of self-respect, a sense of belief in themselves as an antidote to the frustrations and all the negative choices that were being created by the drugs and the sense of hopelessness in where they were living. So he created a foundation that he called the Frederick Douglass Foundation. And he asked me if I'd be willing to help him, put some of these programs together. And I said, of course, I'd be glad to do so. But the only problem was I didn't know very much about Frederick Douglass. And I was pretty certain as I was leaving that meeting, as I thought about it, I thought he had been a slave, but I couldn't tell whether he'd been a slave in the 19th century, the 18th century, or when. And I wasn't even sure that he escaped from slavery at all. And then I began to feel certain kind of embarrassment because I realized that I had grown up in New York City during the whole civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. And my parents were very involved in the movement. My dad was the associate executive director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was very instrumental, as a matter of fact, with Bayard Rustin in 1963 in coordinating the March on Washington. And I'd even graduated from Frederick Douglass Elementary School in Harlem, New York in 1952. I probably shouldn't have said that because that probably puts some age on me, but I don't want to have. But the bottom line is that I knew nothing about Black history. And I thought about it and I realized over the years that back in the 1950s and 60s, Black studies was hardly a major curriculum subject unless you happen to go to an historically Black college or university, or you happen to be very, very fortunate and had parents who were able to give you that kind of understanding, but it was just not a major subject. And so I decided I needed to learn something about Frederick Douglass and very quickly. So I obtained a copy of his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life and Times of Frederick, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. And as I started to read it, I suddenly found myself being blown away by the imagery that he uses in describing the various events of his early life. And I was reading at the time a lot of screenplays, so I was getting a lot of auditions, not much work, but I was getting a lot of auditions. And I realized that these images that he was writing were very visual, very dramatic. And it took me a long time to realize how he was able to write almost like a screenplay in that narrative. And yet screenplays and movies hadn't begun to be done at that time in the 1820s and 1830s. So to make a long story short, I kept thinking about this, and ultimately I found the answer was that it lay in the fact that he had been giving so many lectures and telling his story so often, and he was a very, very good orator. And he knew when he was giving his lectures and talking to people about his life and about slavery, he had to make certain that he gave them things that would keep them awake. Because only when they were awake would they be able to reach into their pockets and put out the money to put into the collection plate to keep the abolitionist cause going. So the bottom line is I thought this is an amazing story. And I would love to be able to share this story with young people. Well, what age should I pick? And the age that came to me was maybe the age of 9. I don't know why I thought 9, it just popped into my head. And then I realized that no 9-year-old kid was going to be able to understand the life of Frederick Douglass. He describes it in a narrative. Until a performance I gave in 1990 at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. and a very dear friend of mine introduced me to a couple of people who had seen the performance, and they came to see me backstage. And the little girl was there, and her mother. And the mother said, "This little girl, my daughter loves Frederick Douglass's life." And I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Do you know, did you learn anything tonight?" She said, "Oh, yes." I said, "Well, answer me a couple of questions. How old was he when he escaped from slavery?" She said, 20. "What was his mother's name?" "Harriet Bailey." And I looked at her and I said, "How old are you, little girl?" She said, "I'm 9. And I realized that all of a sudden, I was way out of my element. I was just making assumptions that I had no right to make. In any case, I realized that 9-year-old kids and older kids would understand it. They could follow it because they also are very, very imagery oriented, particularly today with all the things we have, iPhones and iPods and all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking about this, and I thought that it had been almost a little bit more than 20 years since the March on Washington. And yet the movement for civil rights changed dramatically. And we've seen in this past summer and spring what's going on. And people have become more and more conscious or believing that there's such things as justice, freedom, opportunity for all people had become intermingled with all kinds of other things that were clouding the issue and making people to believe that this country really is not a nation in which you can have opportunity, in which you can become what you really want to become. And then, of course, I remember back in the mid-60s, during a 5-year period, we lost in this nation Medgar Evers, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X, and we lost 5 men who were the national leaders in this nation. And a country cannot lose 5 such individuals and not suffer some kind of consequence. And I personally believe that we are still trying to create that vacuum that those 5 men held, particularly JFK and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. You just can't replace them. And you have to be willing to nurture the people who are there, who have that understanding, that cosmic understanding of life and what you have to do with yourself. So to make a long story short, I decided that if I could put together some kind of a program that would address this sense of hopelessness, this sense of feeling that America offers any kind of real hope, we might be able to accomplish something really important. So I read not only the narrative, but I read his other 2 autobiographies as well. And by the time I finished them, I realized that something had happened to this young boy when he was still a teenager, a young man and then a teenager. And that is, there were 3 things he discovered. One of them, the first one, he got that from his mother and his grandmother. You have to believe in who you are. You have to believe in yourself that you can accomplish things, not just hopelessly, I got to wait for somebody else to do it for me. Secondly, he took advantage of every single opportunity he was given. That's why he gave away his bread to his friends on Alisana Street in Baltimore, who taught him the alphabet, who taught him how to read, how to write. And then thirdly, he discovered when he purchased a book called The Columbian Orator, when he was about, I don't know, maybe somewhere in the neighborhood around 17 or 18. When he bought that book, he began to learn something about the power of the spoken word and the power of the written word as 2 of the most effective means by which you can bring about permanent, positive changes in people's lives. And that was the message that I decided to carry forward through his life, performances of his life, as well as the workshops that I conducted on his life and teaching his legacy. And of course, those keys and the principles and things that I do, that's all copyrighted by my nonprofit company. But the bottom line was, it was very important that people understood what he used, the things that he learned from his parent, from his mother and his grandmother, the things he learned from those white boys on Alisana Street in Baltimore, the things he discovered from himself through the Columbian Orator, that this was how you can achieve success by carving a niche for yourself and your family in the American dream. So that's what I've been doing now for more than 33 years, carrying his full-length play, doing performances in public and private schools, colleges, and so on and so forth, churches. I've spent a number of years doing performances for the National Park Service in Washington, Harper's Ferry, and a variety of other locations as well. Now, toward the end of his life, I want to mention this because this is important. He had an opportunity to visit some of the schools in Eastern Maryland where he had been brought up. And he went to one school, and one of the things that he said to these young people, this is like a middle school, or today would be a junior high school, and he said to them, what has been possible for me is possible for you. And by these words, I believe he meant that his life, when he shares it with people, and when it's shared with other people, can inspire us to keep on keeping on. But by studying his legacy and the keys he followed that brought him success, we have the very same keys that we need to find success today in the 21st century. In other words, Frederick Douglass showed us how the races in this country can learn to live together. And we discover that his wisdom, his practical understanding can guide us to solving one of the largest societal problems we are facing in America today. How can we get along with each other with equanimity? Now, when you visit his home in Anacostia in Washington, D.C., that's now under the care of the National Park Service, and you look into his study, you will see more than 1,000 books on all those bookshelves. He not only owned those books, but he read all of those books, every one of them. And they weren't books that had lots of pictures in them. They were just, some of them were the print was very fine. You have to have glasses to read those things. Okay. But when you read them, you begin to realize that his interests in life were virtually almost cosmic. He loved and studied history, philosophy, anthropology, politics, foreign languages. He could speak German, sociology, music. He played the violin, drama, specifically the works of Shakespeare. And at one point, he belonged to a Shakespeare club in Washington, D.C., where they'd meet once a week and they'd read the plays of Shakespeare. When you walk into his house, in the west parlor on your right-hand side, you'll see a picture that I have behind me on my wall here in my den. It's a picture from Othello where Othello is describing to Desdemona and to her father his life exploits. You can see how deeply in love she's already fallen in love with him. So photography, as John Stouffer told us, and you're picturing Frederick Douglass 2 or 3 years ago when he published that book, Douglass was the most photographic man in the 19th century. I mean, this is an extraordinary human being. So it's important to remember, as we're studying his life, you cannot miss how much his life was influenced by women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the great feminist theoretician, said that of all the men she knew, including her husband, Henry Stanton, who was an abolitionist, no man she ever met understood women as well as he did. And when I read that, I thought to myself, how did he get to that point? And then I didn't take a lot of time to think about it and to read, to go back and look at some of the things he said. And you realize that his commitment to women's rights was forged in his life as a free man and as a slave. It was molded by the hands of 4 women. And you know who those 4 women were? His mother, Harriet Bailey, his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, his first wife, Anna Murray Douglass, his second wife, Helen Pitts Douglass. Their love, their faith in him, their affection for him, and their guidance for him is what turned him into what he became, what he called himself, a woman's rights man. So people who heard him speak, those who read his writings even today, experience a sense of enlightenment. They experience a sense of inspiration because Frederick Douglass understood how to use the English language to instruct and encourage in the most sublime manner you can find. And so I would say in conclusion, I believe as Frederick Douglass believed. Once a person understands how and why a destructive condition exists, he or she is in the right position to remove that condition, not only for the benefit of himself or herself, but for others as well. During his 20 years of enslavement, Frederick Douglass was not successful in everything he tried to do. But even in his failures, he learned to keep on keeping on, to never lose sight of the vision that he was pursuing. In other words, keep his eye on the prize, as Juan Williams has taught us. His freedom to be a citizen of the United States, that's what he wanted, with all the rights and privileges of every other citizen. And when circumstances became difficult, Frederick would remind himself of what he had heard his mother say, what his grandmother reminded him of saying, what he had other slaves always say among themselves: there is a better day coming. His life testifies to the fact that a better day did come for him, and his legacy teaches us that a better day can come for each and every one of us as well.
Hello, I'm Lieutenant Governor Boyd Rutherford, coming to you from the Frederick Douglass statue here inside Maryland's historic State House in Annapolis. Born into slavery on Maryland's Eastern Shore, Frederick Douglass would go on to become one of our nation's most important historical figures. He is famous, of course, not just because of the greatness he achieved in his lifetime, but because of what he had to endure and overcome to achieve such greatness. In fact, before Maryland outlawed slavery in 1864, nearly 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, neither he nor I would have been able to freely enter Maryland State House and step foot here inside our old House chamber. Despite the unjust world which Douglass was born, despite the almost unimaginable challenges and trauma he endured in his lifetime, he never gave up on obtaining his freedom and helping others to do the same. Today, on Frederick Douglass Day and every day, I am grateful for the path that was forged by figures such as Douglass and Harriet Tubman and all the men and women who worked to create a more free and just society, whose actions have made it possible for me to serve as your Lieutenant Governor. There is so much for us today to learn from our history, particularly Maryland's history, both good and bad. And I always have been very vocal in my belief that we should not ignore our history or run from it. As Douglass once said, we have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and the future. We can use our history and the opportunities that we have now to more accurately reflect our past and how we can create a brighter future for the next generation. Thank you to the Frederick Douglass Honor Society for the work that you do to accomplish that mission and to ensure that Douglass's incredible legacy lives on for many years to come.
Hi, I'm Senator Ben Cardin. It is an honor to join you all virtually to celebrate Frederick Douglass Day. Frederick Douglass's wisdom and lifelong activism has inspired individuals and movements in our nation and around the world for over a century. Douglass led the fight to end slavery and became an international advocate for justice until his death in 1895. And his journey began right here in Maryland. Born in Talbot County, Douglass's life began like it did for millions of African Americans during this era, in slavery. Douglass would escape bondage, teach himself to read and write, and become the leading orator, publisher, and activist we know today. His story is the story of Maryland, our state's relationship with the institution of slavery, and the national struggle for emancipation, justice, and self-determination. In Douglass, we find a man who himself lived under the prevailing injustice, and who, once free, made it his life work to liberate others and challenge injustice wherever it persisted. His words and commitment to the pursuit of freedom and civil rights have given us insight on the past and prepared us for the battles in our present time, arming us with wisdom that affirms the fight for the rights and dignities of all people. In tracing his life and his work, we see the transformation of America, and we can use it to lead the transformation of the world we live in today. His teaching, his fight for abolition, lives on the movements for change against enduring inequalities and systemic racism today. Preserving his history here in Maryland on Frederick Douglass Day ensures that his legacy will continue to be a beacon to guide us towards progress and liberation. Thank you to the Frederick Douglass Honor Society and all those involved in today's celebration for preserving our history and helping to keep Douglass' legacy alive for generations to come.